This bizarre story was reported in the media in 2008 in many countries around the world. Theories were proposed, ranging from hypnosis and testing unprecedented drugs to the involvement of secret services with poison gas. But of course, the most significant connection was between the twins. This connection was called a karmic bond, which scientists allegedly still cannot identify or explain to the public. The story began on the morning of May 17, 2008. Traffic police officers from Birmingham, monitoring footage transmitted by traffic cameras to the monitors of London's streets, suddenly discovered two women walking on the median strip of the suburban highway M6. Police patrols were dispatched to the scene, one of which was followed by a film crew from the Daily Morning Show. At the site where the two women were walking in the middle of a busy highway, the police officers and journalists initially thought they were encountering a typical situation. The women would either turn out to be eccentric individuals or drunk or drug-addicted people who had lost their sense of time and place. This incident seemed to pose no particular risks, and it seemed to everyone that this story would soon be forgotten. Who would have thought at that moment that it would take a terrifying turn? As the vehicle with the police officers and journalists drove to the scene, a report came over the radio that one of the women had run into the road and been hit by a car. Nothing was yet known about the severity of the injuries. One of the participants in these events began to regain consciousness. The story became more complicated and already had unfortunate consequences. When the reporters arrived at the scene, they saw that the police officers, who had arrived a little earlier, were already talking to the women on the roadside. Both women seemed uninjured, and the report that one of them had been hit by a car appeared to be a mistake. It later turned out that the woman had indeed been hit by a car on the road, but had fortunately remained uninjured. The twin sisters looked completely normal. They were not staggering, not screaming, and only half-heartedly listened to the officers' warnings, occasionally glancing around. The journalist began filming the officers explaining the incident with the camera, and suddenly something happened that was hard to believe, even if seen with one's own eyes. One of the sisters, Ursula, threw her bag onto the sidewalk and ran into the road just as a large truck was passing by. The quick reaction of the officer, who tried to grab her by the sleeve of her jacket, was unsuccessful. The woman, clearly in a state of mental confusion, accelerated rapidly and simply threw herself down. She did not want to be saved. She desperately wanted to die by being crushed by a massive machine. So, she jumped directly under the wheels of the vehicle. The truck driver managed to react quickly but could not stop immediately. Ursula Eriksson's legs were struck by several wheels of the trailer, causing them to break on the spot. The woman screamed once like a wounded seagull and then lay motionless on the road. Stunned by what they had seen, everyone rushed to help her. At that moment, attention to her sister, Sabine Eriksson, who was lying on the roadside, lapsed for a second, and she immediately took advantage of it. She followed her sister and also ran into the road, where she was hit by a Volkswagen Polo within a second, thrown into the air like a doll. The reality of the incident was hard to grasp. 3 meters apart lay two women on the road, both having wished for death at such a young age. Despite their severe injuries, they were alive and conscious. Ursula Eriksson had open fractures in her pelvis and both legs, with bones tearing through her trousers. Sabine lay on her back, struck by the powerful blow of the car that had shattered the windshield and heavily damaged the roof. Both women said nothing and barely groaned in pain. As they began to recover a little, both tried to stand despite their injuries. They did not listen to pleas and orders to remain still until the ambulance arrived, but suddenly started cursing, spitting, scratching, and fighting against the officers as if they were their worst enemies. It seemed that this fight was their way of staying alive. There was no other way, and for some reason, they repeatedly called for the police, saying, "I recognize you. You are not a real policeman," even though several officers around them kept showing their badges. During this time, Ursula was also in an emotional state, constantly trying to hit the doctors and the arriving ambulance personnel. She bit their hands, spat in their faces, and screamed the foulest curses. To calm the patient, who needed immediate surgical help, she was given a strong dose of sedatives. Only after she calmed down was she airlifted by helicopter. At this point, everyone was convinced that the twin sisters Ursula and Sabine Eriksson had been poisoned with a hallucinogenic substance. Both women were airlifted to the nearest hospital. Ursula underwent surgery. Her spleen was ruptured. Her spine, pelvis, and both legs were broken in several places. Sabina, on the other hand, was not severely injured and was handed over to the police. At this point, about 5 hours had passed since the traffic accident. Sabina had noticeably calmed down and was cheerful. There was no trace of her violent behavior. She was no longer aggressive, responded to questions, but simply did not answer many, did not try to fight or escape. In a word, she behaved normally and appropriately. This is why the police officers who picked her up were initially very surprised. After being told what kind of person they would be dealing with, the officers expected to see a real devil, but a delicate, calm, blonde girl came out of the hospital in a hospital gown and obediently went to the police car. Therefore, Sabina was not handcuffed as she took a seat in the back. Upon arrival at the police station, she talked about the weather, laughed and joked, even flirted with the officers, and allowed herself to be examined and searched. Outwardly, it seemed that this could not be the same Sabine Eriksson who had been a raging fury just a few hours earlier, ready to tear apart anyone who touched her. Now, she behaved calmly and reasonably with other police officers, not those who had tried to calm her down on the road. Soon, everyone began to treat her as relaxed and rational. These officers did not see what Sabina had done on the road. They did not fend off her kicks, did not wipe her spit from their faces, did not see the car she had smashed with her body, did not hear her, and did not try to restrain her by force. It was all somewhere out there in reports for senior colleagues and on the screens of a morning show that these officers could not watch during their shift. They tried talking to her, but Sabina seemed, for some strange reason, to have forgotten everything that had happened to her. She did not ask about her sister's fate, or showed no interest in it, but constantly checked her reflection, worried about her appearance, and looked for her clothes and jewelry. She continued to joke, and when asked about her behavior, she either remained silent or said, "I don't know." She claimed she had never wanted to harm herself or anyone else in her life. Ultimately, the interrogation brought no clarity. Later, tests revealed that neither Eriksson's sister had taken drugs or alcohol. Nothing was found in Sabina's apartment, and the police found no evidence that the sisters had ever used or purchased illegal substances. Sabina was charged with assaulting police officers and causing an accident, while Ursula was obviously pitied and escaped responsibility for her actions. A call to her husband shocked the police. He had no idea where his wife was, what had happened to her, and most importantly, did not seem particularly interested in what crime she had committed. But the real surprise for the investigators dealing with the Eriksson sisters' case was yet to come. After speaking with Sabina on the day of the incident, police and psychiatrists concluded that the woman's mental state was normal, independent of her condition on the M6 motorway. She knew where she was, who was with her, could assess time and space appropriately, and most importantly, was stable and posed no danger to herself or others. It was hard to believe, but it was also only temporary. Now there was no reason to diagnose her or commit her to a psychiatric clinic. Therefore, Sabina was held in custody for a short time. On the morning of May 19, 2008, her trial took place. She was found guilty, pleaded guilty to assaulting a police officer and causing a traffic accident, and was sentenced to a fine and 1 day in jail, which she had already served in custody. Eriksson was released, having forgotten that just a few days earlier she had deliberately thrown herself under a car and in her rage had attacked police officers. Although no one ever understood what kind of temporary madness had befallen her on the road, everyone thought that this state was irrevocably over and she could go home. Later, this decision will be regretted by many people who will never understand what they did wrong. Sabina disappeared into obscurity. Her sister Ursula would undergo several surgeries and then spend about 3 months in a psychiatric clinic. Meanwhile, investigators Ursula would piece together what had preceded the incident on the motorway. It turned out that the twins, Sabina and Ursula, were born on November 3, 1967, in the Swedish city of Sundsvall. They were not the only children. The twins also had an older sister, Mona, and their brother, Bjorn. The twin sisters were in constant contact with each other and their families, but met for the first time in 8 years on the eve of the traffic accident on May 16, 2008. On that day, Ursula flew from the United States to Sabina in Mello and stayed with her. The next day, at 2 a.m., the mysterious sisters, driven by some inner urge, boarded a ferry to Liverpool, England. Once there, they purposefully sought out the police station. In no later interview or interrogation did the sisters ever explain why they left Ireland and went to England. According to the police report, they went to the Liverpool police station at 11:30 a.m. on May 16, 2008, to report that Sabina's children in Mello were in danger. The sisters' story was so incoherent and rambling that the police officers initially could not understand them. After listening to the women's hysterical accounts and not believing them, the officers tried to verify the truth of their statements. They called the Dublin police and found that the police had been called to Sabina Eriksson's house the previous night by neighbors who had heard screams and sounds of a violent family argument. It turned out that the couple had not only quarreled but had also seriously fought. The police tried to calm the couple down and warned them of the consequences. The argument seemed to have settled, and the police left, but no one knew what was going on in the house. After listening to their Dublin colleagues, the Liverpool police realized they were dealing with a desperate woman with marital problems at home. Intervening in such matters is costly, so the women were advised to calm down and return home to their children. When they left the police station, however, the Eriksson sisters did not go back home to Mello, but took a National Express bus to London at 11:30 a.m. Both carried rather large bags that were difficult to hold. The express bus driver immediately pointed out to the passengers that such luggage should be stowed in the bus's luggage compartment, but the women stubbornly refused to part with their bags. After initial grumbling, the driver let the sisters board the bus, but watched them in the rearview mirror throughout the journey, soon noticing their unusual behavior. The sisters appeared incredibly tense and constantly looked around. They whispered to each other and seemed to be planning something while clinging to their bags, as if they were their greatest treasure or their salvation from certain death. When they reached the next bus stop, the driver dropped the strange women off and reported them to the station supervisor. The supervisor immediately called the police and reported that 2 women were at the stop who might have a bomb in their bags. When the police arrived and searched the Eriksson sisters, they found nothing suspicious and considered the call a false alarm. Had they paid more attention to the twins' mental state at that time, they might have interrupted the series of terrible events that followed. But at that moment, their task was to prevent a possible terrorist attack, not to look into the minds of strangers. So, the sisters were released. As it turned out, for some reason, they had no money to get to London. It is unknown what was going through their minds at that time, but they likely saw the only way to reach the British capital by walking along the central strip of the M6 motorway, where they were seen on the monitors by traffic inspectors that day. You know the rest, but that is not the end of this fascinating story. Let's return to the released Sabina, who, according to psychiatrists, police officers, and judges, had returned to normalcy and no longer posed a danger to society. When she left the courthouse, she was told to go home to her husband and children, but she did not think of doing so. Instead, she wandered thoughtfully through the city, for some reason wearing her sister Ursula's green cardigan, which she had discarded before being run over by the truck, and carried her belongings given by the police in a bag. She walked into one of the city's parks, where she met 2 local men, 54-year-old Glenn Hollinshead and his friend Peter. They had just had a few glasses of spice beer in the bar and were now walking their dog, enjoying the springtime beauty with pleasant conversation. Sabina, feeling lonely and separated from her twin sister, or perhaps in a new state of madness, wanted to talk to someone. She approached the dog, petted it, said something kind, and then began a conversation with the men, word for word. She told them her sad story, that her twin sister had had a severe car accident and was now in the hospital, but she did not know which hospital, that she had no one here and no place to stay, and that her sister urgently needed to be found. Tears welled up in her eyes, and the men, moved by her distress, wanted to help her. Glenn, a former military doctor, was a sympathetic and open-hearted man and offered Sabina a place to stay for a few days. Moreover, he assured the unfortunate woman that he would help her find her sister. From that moment on, the kind man's fate was sealed. About 24 hours later, he would be brutally murdered by the woman he had offered his help to in his own home. The trio arrived at Glenn's house around 7 p.m. Initially, they only talked and drank beer. Sabina seemed very agitated, tense, and kept talking about her sister. She would sit down, jump up, rush to the window, and try to see something in the depths of the dark night. Then she would pull the curtains tightly shut, tremble, and be desperately afraid of something without giving any explanation. Soon, her behavior became strange. She refused to eat or drink, offered the men her cigarettes, and then snatched them out of their mouths, claiming they might be poisoned. Shortly before midnight, Peter grew tired of the strange spectacle, said goodbye, and left. What happened between Glenn and Sabina afterward is known only to Sabina herself. It is only known that Mr. Collins called his brother Paul, who worked at the University Hospital of North Staffordshire, around noon the next day and told him about the woman and her sister. He asked for help in obtaining information about Ursula's whereabouts, but realized it would not be easy. Then there is another dark spot in the story where no one knows what happened. On May 20th at 2:45 p.m., Glenn came out of his house and saw his neighbor Frank, who was washing his car in a cul-de-sac. He asked him for a few tea bags, got what he wanted, and went home. But just a minute later, he reappeared on the street, already bleeding. The only thing he could say was, "She stabbed me with a knife," and he fell dead on the cobblestones. According to police records, the ambulance arrived at the scene around 8 p.m., but as they approached the victim's house, the paramedics saw a true fury on the road, or rather on the safety island, a woman hitting herself on the head with a hammer. It later turned out that this woman was Sabina Eriksson. Just a few minutes earlier, she had stabbed Glenn multiple times in the kitchen and now stood completely deranged on the road, injuring herself and threatening other people. Some of the paramedics rushed to check if the injured man was still alive, while two ran towards Sabina. At the same time, one of the passing drivers, Joshua Grittick, braked in front of her, jumped out of his car and tried to take the hammer away from the mad woman. But Sabina once again showed incredible skill and strength. She dodged, pulled a stone from her pocket, and struck her would-be rescuer, causing him to fall to the ground. Seeing this absurd and terrifying turn of events, the paramedics immediately realized they were dealing with a dangerous patient who had to be neutralized and isolated at any cost. Although it is not usually the task of medical personnel to chase the insane, they rushed at Sabina to pin her down. But like a raging beast, she twisted with incredible speed and sprinted straight down the highway, scaring drivers with her swinging hammer. The chase lasted several minutes. It soon became clear that the woman was heading towards a multi-story motorway junction about 12 meters above the road. With a single leap, she climbed the bridge railing and, without a moment's hesitation, plunged into the depths. Thus ended one of the most bizarre and mysterious chases ever experienced in Britain. Sabina Eriksson survived, and her inexplicable episodes of madness probably gave her the strength of a movie superhero. What would have ended in death for most people ended for Sabina with only broken legs and head injuries in a hospital ward. She began behaving entirely normally again. Her aggression, delusions, and paranoia were gone. Either she genuinely remembered nothing of her actions or hid it masterfully. In any case, she told no one about it afterward. On June 6, 2008, she was brought in a wheelchair to her first court hearing. The prosecution had a long list of charges against the defendant and a complete lack of explanations and motives. Sabina's defense attorney fared no better. He had absolutely no idea how to explain his client's actions. Both sides quickly agreed that despite the psychiatrist's assessment that the defendant was currently sane, it was evident that both women were not themselves at the time of the crimes. How else could one explain what they did within a few days? Both the coroner and the leading psychiatrist in the country, Nigel Eastman, who participated in the trial, agreed with the defense. He described Sabina Eriksson's state at the time of the murder as an induced delusional disorder manifesting as mass psychosis, and said that she was now completely healthy at the time of the trial. The defense psychiatrist said that Sabina had clearly suffered from acute palimpsestic psychotic disorder in moments of madness, also caused by mass psychosis. In the fall of 2009, a British court charged Sabina Eriksson with several crimes, including the manslaughter of Glenn Hollinshead. She pleaded guilty but argued that she could not remember anything, had no malicious intent, and did everything in a state of confusion. Judge Justin Sanders described Sabina Eriksson's case as the most challenging in his career and stated that her guilt in the crimes was very low as she was unaware of her actions. He also added, "I understand that the family of the deceased victim will not be satisfied with my verdict. Nonetheless, I render the judgment based on the fact that the cause of the murder was a temporary insanity, and therefore the defendant's guilt is minor. The punishment aims not to penalize the defendant and does not reflect the suffering endured by Mr. Hollinshead's family." The cause of all the actions of the two twin sisters was attributed to mass psychosis, known by different names in various languages. Sabina Eriksson was thus sentenced to only 5 years in prison because the first crazy one was her sister Ursula, who infected Sabina with madness, and the virus of madness caused the woman to start hearing non-existent voices dictating strange actions. She suffered from delusional beliefs that she held as true. The case of the twin sisters Sabina and Ursula Eriksson is a case where the defendants could do nothing to prevent severe consequences. In September 2009, Sabina was sent to an ordinary women's prison, where she served only 439 days, less than a year and a half, and was then released on amnesty. Throughout her time behind bars, no one ever noticed any signs of mental illness in her. It was as if Sabina and Ursula had once succumbed to madness in May 2008 and then never thought about it again. One sister returned to live and work in the United States, while the other continued to live with her husband and children in Ireland. Neither sister has ever answered questions about what happened to them in May 2008. Some people still believe that the criminal justice system failed in the Eriksson sisters' case because it did not answer many questions or hold those responsible accountable. However, most people still tend to absolve the women themselves. Their actions are compared to the syndrome of a rabid dog. A sick animal is supposedly not responsible for its illness, but someone should have kept an eye on it and prevented it from biting innocent people. So said the brother of the murdered Glenn Hollinshead. "Harry, I question the criminal justice system for allowing Sabina Eriksson to remain free and commit a severe crime. Her mental state should have been recognized in time, and she should have been isolated." But psychiatrists throw up their hands at his words. Without any diagnostic systems, they cannot identify such a state at first glance. Interestingly, the Eriksson sisters' elder brother, Bjorn, disagrees with the court's verdict, though for a different reason than the deceased victim's brother. In his opinion, Ursula and Sabina did not fall into a state of temporary insanity in May 2008, but were indeed fleeing from a real danger. He claims the women were running from a certain mad stalker who had threatened them, so they preferred to die and threw themselves under a car. To this day, the story of the strange madness of the twin sisters Ursula and Sabina Eriksson remains a great mystery.
On the morning of August 31, 2003, the lifeless body of 22-year-old Katie Sepich was found near a remote landfill in Las Cruces, New Mexico. She was last seen by friends leaving a house party. It took almost 4 years for her murderer to be identified. Katie was described by her mother as an open, cheerful, and intelligent person. She grew up in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and was the oldest child in the family. Katie graduated from New Mexico State University with a degree in business administration and was about to attend graduate school for business administration. She worked as a waitress at a local Mexican restaurant. Katie was a very outgoing person. During her studies, she met a man named Joe Biscoff. The friendly relationship between the two quickly developed into something romantic. Katie told her mother, Jane, that she was happy with Joe. She wanted to build a future with him, and a few months later her dream came true when Joe gave her a diamond ring. In the summer of 2003, as Katie and Joe were finishing their studies, they encountered difficulties in their relationship. Katie decided to continue her studies, and Joe moved back to his parents' house in Gallup, New Mexico, a small town about 350 miles from Las Cruces. Katie was very upset that Joe had to leave her. The long-distance relationship was unbearable, but they still saw each other occasionally. In 2003, on Labor Day weekend, Joe came to Las Cruces and Katie was overjoyed. But the weekend they spent together ended tragically. On Saturday, August 3, 2003, Katie enjoyed herself with Joe and her friends, moving from one bar to another before arriving at a local party where she disappeared. The next day, Katie's mother, Jane, received a call that changed her life forever. Veronica, Katie's roommate, told Jane that her daughter had left the party alone that night. Veronica and Joe were sleeping in the house where the party was being held. They thought Katie had gone home, but in the morning it turned out that she was nowhere to be found. Her family contacted the police and reported her missing. At about the same time, someone discovered the body of a woman who was wearing almost no clothes near a landfill in the desert. There were no documents next to the body, but after seeing external signs, the police concluded that the body had not been there for more than a day. It was immediately clear that the victim's death was not due to an accident. She appeared to be about 20 to 25 years old. She was naked below the waist, so the motive for the crime was obvious. Her hands showed signs of self-defense. She had fought for her life by scratching the attacker. Under her fingernails were particles of the perpetrator's skin, so the police had a DNA sample of the perpetrator who had taken her life. There were strangulation marks on her neck, which at first glance were the most likely cause of death. The investigators could not find any signs of a struggle near the body, which led them to conclude that she had died in another location. Apparently, the perpetrator had brought the body to this remote desert landfill in the hope that it would take a long time before it was found. Something else shocking was found on the victim's body: burn marks on her arms and back. This suggested that the perpetrator had tried to dispose of the body or destroy evidence by attempting to set the victim on fire. The police quickly established a connection between Kott's disappearance and the discovery of the body. The father traveled to the morgue to identify the body. The residents of the once peaceful Las Cruces were horrified by what had happened to Katie. The police were doing everything they could to find the perpetrator as quickly as possible because there was no guarantee that this man would not commit another crime. When the police began investigating Katie's case, they wanted to find out as much as possible about the last hours of her life, where and with whom she had been, what she had done, whether she had argued with anyone, and whether she had any enemies. The distance between the location where the party was held and the house where Katie lived was about a mile, so the police had to find out whether she had made it to her house or not. First, the investigators spoke with Veronica, her roommate, and Joe, her boyfriend. They found it strange that the two had stayed at the party and Katie had gone home alone in the middle of the night. Joe showed no willingness to cooperate with the police. He said Katie had left her purse, her phone, and her keys behind. The investigators began to investigate Katie's route. They went from door to door and interviewed the residents in the hope of getting clues from them, but unfortunately that didn't help. No one had seen or heard anything. The rumor spread that Katie had made it to her house but had never gone inside because she didn't have her keys with her. The investigators searched the house and the surrounding area and found the shoes under her bedroom window. Apparently, she wanted to get into the house through the window, whereupon someone attacked her. The footprints on the gravel near the house also indicated this. Kot fought for her life, but unfortunately the perpetrator was stronger. The investigators suspected that after taking Katie's life, the perpetrator took her to a landfill in the desert and tried to set her on fire. They began to wonder whether it was a stranger or someone she knew and trusted. There were about 40 people at the party. Maybe someone followed Katie when she went home and attacked her. Could that person have been her boyfriend? The investigators wanted to find answers to these questions. They interviewed all the attendees of the party and discovered an important detail that Joe had not mentioned. Several witnesses reported that Katie saw Joe kissing another woman. Later, they saw the couple arguing. For this reason, Katie went home alone and forgot her purse. She was angry and wanted to leave the place as quickly as possible. However, when the police questioned Joe for the first time, he said nothing about it. He also said nothing to her parents, who wanted to know why their daughter had left the party alone. The investigators questioned Joe again. They told him that they knew that he and she had argued because she had seen him kissing another woman. Joe admitted that this was true. When Katie went home, he followed her in his car. Allegedly, Joe drove to her house but didn't go inside. He saw that the light in her room was off and thought she was sleeping, so he went back to the party. So it turns out that Joe wasn't at the party when Katie was attacked. No one who the investigators questioned could say for sure when Joe came back. He probably had time to commit the crime, then take Katie's lifeless body to the desert and return to the party. When the investigators questioned those who attended the event, they discovered another strange detail. At the party, Joe started calling Katie on her cell phone, which was in her purse. When the ringing sounded, the man saw the phone and realized that Kot had forgotten it. But for some reason, he kept calling her until morning. Maybe he wanted to create an alibi in this way and show that he was worried about his girlfriend. The investigators wanted an explanation from Joe for his strange behavior, but he refused to talk. Katie loved Joe very much, but he didn't even attend her funeral, which aroused even more suspicion. All the investigators needed to rule out Joe as a possible suspect was a DNA sample from him. The forensic scientists found DNA samples in 3 different places on Katie's body. Most of them were under her fingernails. All the samples found belonged to the same person. The police wanted to compare Joe's DNA with the DNA found on Katie's body, but there was a problem. Joe left town and his parents hired a lawyer who reported that Joe refused to give his DNA sample. If you look at the man's behavior, there is no doubt that he has something to hide and that he has something to do with Katie's death. The police had to find a legal way to get his DNA, but that took time. In the meantime, the investigators followed other leads. They investigated similar cases and tried to find out whether Kot was the only victim of the man who took her life. The DNA samples found on her body were compared with a national database, but there were no matches. The investigators decided to return to the place where it all began, the party. They identified all the men at that party and asked them to give DNA samples. All the men agreed because they had nothing to hide. However, no matches with their DNA were found on Katie's body, and that brought the investigators back to Joe. He was the only one who refused to make his DNA available. The investigators found another way to get it. They found out that Katie and Joe had spent some time in her bedroom before the party, where they had intimate contact. The police went to the house and pulled the sheet off Katie's bed, assuming that they would find Joe's DNA there, and they were right. The lab actually found a male DNA sample, but it didn't match the one found on Katie's body. That means that Joe wasn't the one who attacked her. Why then did he refuse to cooperate with the police? if he had something to do with the incident with his girlfriend. The police sent the test results to Joe's lawyer. After learning that he had been removed from the list of suspects, Joe decided to contact the police and give a DNA sample of himself. The new test confirmed the original result that Joe was not involved in the crime. When asked for an explanation for his refusal to cooperate with the police, Joe said that he and Katie had intimate contact before the party, so he was afraid that they would find his DNA on her body. Joe's behavior on the night of Katie's death remained a mystery to the police and her family. After Joe was ruled out as a suspect, the police had to look for other leads. Several people at the party told the investigators that Katie was wearing rings on her fingers that night, including the one Joe had given her. However, when Katie's body was discovered, there were no rings on her fingers. The police believed that the rings had been removed by the person who killed her. They searched all the pawnshops in the area but never found Katie's jewelry. Another possible clue was a tire track near the place where Katie's body was found. The forensic scientists were able to identify the make and model of the tires. The manufacturer told the police that these tires were usually used on pickups. Unfortunately, that didn't bring them any closer to the perpetrator, and the case stalled. About a year later, someone in Wisconsin committed a very similar crime to the one involving Cott. Someone attacked a woman in Green Bay and did the same thing to her. The victim was also set on fire but luckily survived. She told the police that she pretended to be dead and that was the only reason she survived. When the perpetrators were gone, she put out the fire and went to a neighbor's house for help. She said she was attacked by 2 Hispanic men. But in Katie's case, all the evidence pointed to only one person. The police had to carry out DNA tests to confirm or rule out a connection between the 2 crimes. The victim from Wisconsin described in detail to the police the appearance of the men who had attacked her. When the police in Green Bay published the pictures, one of the farmers recognized his workers Gregorio Morales and Juan Nieto in the pictures. One of the 2 had relatives in Las Cruces and often visited them. Both men were arrested. The police investigating the Katie case believed they had finally found the perpetrators. However, the results of the DNA tests proved the opposite. The samples did not match the DNA found on Katie's body. The 2 men were later convicted of assaulting the woman in Green Bay but had nothing to do with the Kate case. Nieto was sentenced to 70 years in prison, Morales to 50 years. This once again brought the investigators to a dead end. The only evidence the police had was tire tracks from the crime scene and DNA samples from the perpetrator. Katie's family had hoped that the police would be able to identify the man who took their daughter's life with the help of DNA tests, but there were problems. It was illegal to take a DNA sample from a person arrested by the police. On December 18, 2006, 3.5 years after Katie's death, there was a breakthrough in the case. The lab discovered a DNA sample that matched the DNA found on Katie's body. The man who attacked Katie was 26-year-old Gabriel Adrian Avila. He didn't know Katie but had an extensive criminal record and had been released from prison shortly before Katie's death. On November 13, 2003, less than 3 months after the brutal murder of KT, Avila was arrested for breaking into the apartment of 2 young women with a knife. The residents escaped the attack by locking themselves in the bathroom and calling the emergency number. In March 2004, he was convicted of aggravated assault. However, the files show that Avila fled after being released on bail. He could have been arrested as early as 3 months after the attack on Katie, but due to a faulty system, his connection to Katie's death was only established 3.5 years later. The fugitive escaped the police for almost a year before being arrested in November 2004 on the basis of a tip. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison. When he was admitted to prison, Avila was given a DNA sample, but it took another 2 years to analyze it. When the results showed a partial match with the DNA from the location of Katie's body, the investigators became active and quickly found the truck in which Avila had disposed of the body. They found a ring that belonged to Katie on the center console. This case showed that the system had to be changed. The police spent 3 years of resources and time searching for the perpetrator, but Avila could have been arrested much earlier if he had been given a DNA sample when he was first arrested. It is also surprising that his DNA sample was not tested until 2 years later in 2006. The investigators in the Katie case visited the prison to speak with Avila. When he saw Katie's ring, which was found in his pickup, he admitted to committing the crime. He said he was in the area that evening to buy illegal substances while his wife was not at home. At that moment, he saw Katie and asked her if she needed a ride. She replied that this was not the case. He then saw her again in front of the house. Katie tried to get into her bedroom through the window, but Avila attacked her and began to undress her. After that, he didn't know what to do and decided to strangle Katie because he feared that she would later identify him. Then he loaded Katie's body into his pickup and drove it to a junkyard in the desert where he laid it on the ground. He assumed that burning the body would destroy all the evidence, but he was wrong. A sample of Avila's DNA was taken again and there was a match. When DNA traces were found on Katie's body in 2003, her parents hoped that this would lead to a quick resolution, but in New Mexico and in almost all other federal states, it was illegal to carry out DNA tests at the time of the arrest. The DNA was only entered into the system when a person was convicted and put in prison. This triggered a nationwide campaign led by Katie's parents and demanding a law named after their daughter in all 50 federal states. The law stipulated that anyone arrested for a violent crime must submit a DNA sample, which is then entered into the National CODI database. In 2006, the bill was passed by the legislature of New Mexico with only 5 votes against and came into force in March 2006. Thanks to the tireless efforts of Katie's parents, the law became federal law in 2010. Meanwhile, there is a similar law in more than 31 federal states as in New Mexico. David Katie's father said his greatest fear was that someone else would die at the hand of his daughter's murderer, but now he can put that fear to rest. Opponents argue that the procedure constitutes an invasion of privacy and a violation of civil rights. Others point out that DNA differs from fingerprints in that it contains sensitive genetic information. In the case, a federal district court confirmed that a federal law that allows samples to be taken and entered into a national DNA database before a conviction does not violate constitutional rights. The trial against Gabriel Adrian Avila began in 2007. He apologized to Katie's family, and his lawyer urged the judge to show leniency as Avila repents his actions. District Attorney Suzanne Martinez, however, argued that Avila waited more than 3 years after the murder to make his confession and only made it after the investigators presented him with evidence. At the sentencing, Katie's father David urged the judge not to be lenient with the sentence. In May 2007, Gabriel Adrian Avila was found guilty and sentenced to 69 years in prison. He will be released on parole in 2043 after serving a 30-year sentence. Jane Katie's mother promised that she and her husband would continue to work to ensure that Katie's law is passed in all 50 states in order to commemorate her daughter. Thanks for watching and take care. On the evening of May 4, 1982, 13-year-old Terry Ryan literally stormed into his family's home in the suburb of Priven, near the capital of Queensland in northeastern Australia, and told his mother an unbelievable story. According to Terry, he had just been forced by two men to participate in the prolonged torture and murder of his best friend, Peter Aston. Peter's body was buried in a shallow grave in the bush about 60 km south of the New South Wales border. After hearing her son's report, the desperate woman immediately called the police and accompanied her son to the nearest police station. In the early hours of May 5, Terry told his story to a sergeant and a detective from the Queensland Criminal Investigation Branch. Around 4:45 a.m., the officers drove Terry and his mother across the border to New South Wales, to the Tweed Heads police station, where they were joined by the local police chief and a local detective. Following the boys' instructions, they first went to a trash can in the nearby Fox Park and examined its contents. Then they inspected the sink, walls, urinal, and stall of the local public restroom. From there, Terry led his mother and the investigators down a sandy path into the bush. But the path led nowhere. There was no grave in the bush as he had described. After the investigators searched 3 more trails in the bush without success, their patience ran out. If this was a teenage prank, it was a very elaborate one. The 4th trail seemed more promising. Fresh tire tracks were visible on the sandy ground. Suddenly, Terry became excited and enthusiastically led everyone forward. After about 200 meters, the trail opened into a clearing, and the tire tracks disappeared into the bush on the other side. Terry suddenly stopped, pointed at the foliage, and said, "Over there, that's it." The investigators continued, and after leaving the path, they came across a fresh mound of earth in the northeast. This was the grave Terry had spoken of. The mound was covered with small branches and twigs clearly broken from nearby trees. At this point, Terry returned to his mother's arms and wept. As the officers approached the ominous mound and examined the freshly dug earth in the light of dawn, they saw bloodstains on the sand and a large, wet, blood-soaked area in the middle of the disturbed soil. On the sand at the head of the grave in the bush lay a dark sock and a knife in a bundle. Around the grave were many chewed matchsticks. But what the police discovered beneath the grave almost exceeded their imagination. Every part of 13-year-old Peter Aston's naked body had been desecrated. The dead boy was over 2 meters tall and had literally been bent in half so his body would fit into the disproportionately small pit, which was clearly not long enough for him. An autopsy performed later that day at Tweed Heads County Hospital revealed numerous cuts, bruises, abrasions, hematomas, and fractures all over Peter's body. In some places on his head, his hair had been cut short. He had a deep laceration on the back of his head, a bruise on the left side of his head, a skull fracture with brain damage, cigarette burns on the front of his chest, severe damage to his scrotum and genitals, and no pubic hair. The presence of sand in his nose, trachea, and bronchi was most likely caused by inhalation. Experts speculated that Peter may have died from the skull fracture, but given the sand in his nose, mouth, trachea, and bronchi, it was more likely that he suffocated after being buried. After Terry recovered from the shock of seeing the place where his best friend had died, he was able to tell the police all the details of the previous day. The 2 boys had met at school and lived not far from each other. Shortly before Peter's death, they had become close friends. Peter was tall and suffered from myopia, which was why he had worn glasses since childhood. The combination of his thick glasses and lanky build made him the target of ridicule at school, so Peter and Terry spent most of their time skipping class and shoplifting. On May 4, he and Peter decided to skip school. Peter wanted to hitchhike to his hometown of Melbourne to see his older brother. Terry agreed to accompany him as far as the Gold Coast and then return home. Around 8:30 a.m., they met under the name Sands and went to a nearby lake for a swim. By 10:30 a.m., they were at the Kingston train station and boarded a train to Brisbane. The boys then got off at the Brownswood Street station and went to a shopping mall where they bought shoes, jeans, and a shirt. From there, they took the train to Woodridge, where Peter stole a pack of cigarettes from Kmart. Then they took the train to Binley, where they each bought a jacket at Kohl's. By noon, the boys went to the Gold Coast Highway to continue their hitchhiking journey. Along the way, they saw a yellow Daihatsu with four-wheel drive and an open hood. One man was bent over the engine and another sat in the passenger seat. The boys approached the car and asked the men if they could take them to the coast. The man at the hood told them to get in, as he was almost done with the repairs and they would leave soon. So Terry and Peter found themselves in a car with two strangers. Terry described the men as both dressed in jeans and sweaters, calling themselves Bob and Paul. Bob was much older than Paul, who sat next to Peter, while Terry sat in the back next to Paul. At first, everything seemed fine, but as soon as the car started moving, Paul pulled out a gun from under a blanket on the floor and held it to Terry's head. After driving for a while, Bob pulled the car over to the side of the road. Paul warned Peter that he would get a bullet in the head or back if he moved. The men took handcuffs from their pockets and alternately cuffed Peter's hands on the passenger seat and then Terry's hands in front of him. The car then sped back onto the highway. After a while, Peter told the men his arms were getting tired, so Bob stopped, removed the handcuffs, and chained him to the dashboard bar. During the drive, Bob slapped Peter for no reason, and Paul jabbed him in the chin with the barrel of his gun. Paul also punched Terry in the face. The car then crossed the border into New South Wales, and Bob drove into thick bushland before stopping. In Terry's words, the incident unfolded as follows. Paul got out, walked to the other side of the car, and pulled Terry out. He forced him to spread his legs by placing his hands on the car roof, and after searching him, he cuffed his hands. Bob removed Peter's handcuffs, pulled him out of the car, and threw him to the ground. Both were then dragged roughly across the ground to the shore, where they were forced to lie face down with their legs spread and arms outstretched. First, they stripped Peter of all his clothes. Peter resisted, but it was useless. Terry was then forced to lie on his stomach with his hands cuffed behind his back and watch as they began beating Peter. Terry heard a cracking sound. It was the rifle stock Paul used to smash Peter's jaw so hard it broke. After letting Peter rest for a while, they began stabbing him with knives they had pulled from their pockets. They had about 5 knives in total. Peter tried to scream, but they gagged him with his torn shirt. Bob then walked over to Terry and punched him in the face, making his nose bleed. Bob took a leather stamp from his pocket and gave it to Paul, who used it to strike both of Peter's ears. Bob then forced Terry to lean over the bleeding Peter and perform oral sex on him. While doing this, Bob cut off several of Peter's pubic hairs, shoved them into Terry's mouth, and forced him to swallow them. At some point, when Paul and Bob were distracted, Peter managed to stand up and tried to run away. Paul chased him down and knocked him over. Bob tied Peter's toes together and said, "Let's see you run now." Peter got up again and tried to escape, but Paul caught him once more. Bob then took a shovel from the trunk and began hitting Peter on the head. The blows were extremely hard. He struck him with the sharp edge. One of them removed Terry's handcuffs, handed him the shovel, and told him to hit Peter on the head. Terry did so, but as gently as possible to avoid hurting Peter too much. To avoid suffering the same fate as Peter, Terry asked if he could join them. One of them replied, "How can we trust you?" Terry responded, "But you saw me hit him with the shovel, didn't you?" The entire time, Peter just lay on the ground, his blood everywhere. Bob handcuffed Peter and Paul began waving the gun around. Bob then shaved Peter's head while Paul held his legs. After that, Bob stabbed Peter in the head. Peter was nearly dead when Bob took Terry to find a spot to dig. The first location had too many tree roots, so they returned to where Peter lay and began digging there. When they came back, Terry saw Paul standing over Peter, zipping up his pants while Peter simply lay on the ground. They then placed him in the hole and covered him with dirt and branches. Terry later recounted, "After that, they took everything they had, put me in the car, and we drove off. During the drive, they told me they worship Satan and that they had to do this as a sacrifice. Along the way, they stopped, threw Peter's clothes in a trash can, used the restroom, and washed up. Bob threw Peter's hat off a bridge, Paul tossed his glasses in the trash, and then they went to a cafe and bought food. I didn't eat any of it, Terry said. They wanted to know where I lived. I had a pocket knife in case someone tried to hurt me or something. When we stopped in front of the house, Bob got out, opened the back door, and let me out. Then he shook my hand and made me promise not to tell anyone. He said if I did, the same thing would happen to me. After that, I ran straight home and told my mother what happened, and she called the police. Despite intense questioning, Terry Ryan couldn't remember much. Investigators attributed this to the boy being in shock, but were confident he would recall more details in later interrogations. The fact that the mysterious Paul and Bob had driven Terry home after murdering his friend initially raised police suspicions. However, the discovery of Peter Aston's body in a bush grave eliminated any doubts. Investigators realized they were dealing with two deranged killers who were also naive and stupid. In the early hours of May 6, about 24 hours after Terry Ryan led police to his murdered friend's grave, Robert Panetti was awakened by someone shaking his leg as he slept in his room at an army barracks on the outskirts of Brisbane. It was 17-year-old Private Paul Luckman and 34-year-old Corporal Robin Bob Reed. Panetti knew Reed well as they had once shared a room before falling out. Reed had a habit of rooming with every new private who joined the unit. Luckman had arrived about 2 weeks earlier and was immediately placed in Reed's room. Since then, the two had been inseparable. Reed and Luckman were both wearing jackets and jeans, and Reed was clutching his stomach, seemingly in severe pain. Luckman explained that he believed his friend had a severe case of food poisoning and asked Panetti if he could drive them to the nearest hospital outside the base. Panetti agreed, quickly dressed, and the three men left the barracks and headed to Panetti's car parked across the lot. Panetti took the driver's seat. Reed sat beside him and Luckman sat in the back. But as Panetti tried to start the car, he felt the sharp blade of a knife at his throat. Luckman held the handle with his left hand and pressed the blade with his right. He then explained that they needed his car and this was no joke. At this point, Reed had miraculously recovered from his food poisoning. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his jacket pocket and cuffed Panetti's hands behind his back. Panetti was then dragged out of the car and placed in the back seat. Reed and Luckman went to the trunk of the Daihatsu and began transferring their belongings into Panetti's car. Once finished, they got into Panetti's car and drove off. After about 15 minutes of driving, Luckman suddenly turned to Panetti and said, "The guy who was killed at the Gold Coast, that was us." By this point, news of Peter Aston's body being found had already made headlines in all local media. As a shocked Panetti processed what he had just heard, Luckman added, "We only did it for fun, but it was a mistake." Later, when they stopped at a gas station, Luckman asked Panetti, "Can I trust you?" and whether he should remove the handcuffs. Panetti said yes. Luckman warned him not to try to escape and outlined their plan. They would drive Panetti's car through Warwick and then drop him off outside town. When they arrived in Warwick, Reed bought 2 newspapers. The front page featured a picture of Peter Aston and a report on his murder. After reading the paper, Luckman was outraged. "Most of what's written here is a load of crap," he said. "The other 13-year-old boy we let go, it says he was dropped off on the street. That's also nonsense. We dropped him off in front of his house. It wasn't 3:30 a.m., it was earlier. And when we got out of the car, he shook our hands." After driving around a bit more, Luckman told Panetti, "We're about to drop you off without doing what Terry did to us." "Who's Terry?" Panetti asked. "The other 13-year-old boy who went to the police," Reed replied. Remarkably, Panetti somehow managed to convince Luckman and Reed that he wouldn't turn them in. Luckman, convinced he could be trusted, gave Panetti $1, some silver, a pack of cigarettes, and a lighter, then told him to get lost. As soon as Panetti was free, he went straight to the nearest police station and reported what had happened. Thanks to this information, Luckman and Reed were arrested that same day at noon. Their car was spotted by a police patrol and backup was called. Local police arrested Bob and Paul without resistance at the nearest checkpoint. On May 5, after questioning Terry Ryan, all local radio stations broadcast a description of the car and its occupants, who responded to the names Bob and Paul. Everyone was warned to stay away from the vehicle and call the police immediately, as the occupants were armed and dangerous. Soon, police received an anonymous tip that the wanted vehicle might belong to two soldiers, 17-year-old Private Paul Luckman and 34-year-old Corporal Robin Bobby Reed, and that the latter might be at an army barracks on the outskirts of Brisbane. After the call, a team of NSW investigators arrived at room 29 of Barrack Block N9, but quickly realized no one was there. On a nearby parking lot, they found the Daihatsu described by Terry Ryan. A look inside confirmed that the interior and contents matched the boy's description exactly. Inside the vehicle, investigators found 3 knives and a baton. After examining the car, they searched Reed and Luckman's room. The room was messy and divided into 4 areas, with the 2 front sections occupied by beds. A search of the room uncovered 37 knives of various shapes and sizes displayed in different areas, along with 8 bullets, a saber, a bayonet, and 2 scalpels, all mounted on walls and in a cabinet. Investigators then searched the front of the room and discovered a pair of jeans and a red and white floral patterned shirt, both stained with blood. Among the books in Reed and Luckman's room, they found a photo album filled with human hair samples glued to each page, labeled with the donor's name and body part. They also found dozens of books on Satanism, including the Devil's Prayer Book, the Satanic Bible, and History of Witchcraft. While investigators searched the barracks, police radio broadcast that Reed and Luckman had been arrested and were being held at the Glen Innes police station. Immediately after receiving this information, investigators collected evidence from the suspect's room and drove to Glen to interrogate Luckman and Reed. During questioning, both gave contradictory stories, mostly blaming each other, and Terry Ryan, the boy they had trusted but who had instead turned them in. Later that night, both men were formally charged with the murder of Peter Aston, assault, and the attempted murder of Terry Ryan. The next morning, Reed and Luckman appeared in court. During the hearing, investigators requested bail be denied and for them to be sent back to Tweed Heads. The following day, investigators took Reed on a tour of the crime scene. Reed was a tall, well-built man wearing jeans, a cowboy shirt, and flat-soled cowboy boots. He was so vain that he genuinely believed he had the situation under control, regardless of the circumstances. On the way, he asked the officers to stop and buy him a box of matches. When they handed it to him, he immediately put a matchstick in his mouth and chewed it like a cowboy, explaining the chewed matches found at the grave. He probably thought it made him look cool. Upon arrival, Reed described the events of that night in great detail. He was very cooperative, proudly recounting everything from start to finish, including all of Luckman and Terry Ryan's actions. He even pointed out where all the weapons had been stashed, and when investigators checked, they were indeed there. Reed basked in his 15 minutes of fame the entire time. The officers played along, praising him for remembering so much. The more they indulged him, the more he strutted around, reconstructing the event step by step. At one point, he even sat on the sand by the grave and laughed, a truly chilling and disgusting sight. Once Reed and Luckman were behind bars, investigators began piecing together why these men had committed such a horrific crime seemingly without motive. Robin Reed was born on October 20, 1948 in Hampshire, England. On January 16, 1961, he immigrated to Australia with his family, settling in Queensland. Reed dropped out of school at 14, working odd jobs as a laborer, painter, and salesman. At some point, he became obsessed with bows, arrows, and knives of all kinds. Reed joined the army in 1972 and eventually ended up at a barracks on the outskirts of Brisbane. There, he rose to the rank of corporal and was tasked with supervising privates. Paul Luckman was born on November 1, 1964, in Melbourne to a broken family. Until age 13, he was raised by his father and stepmother before being taken in by his biological mother, an abusive alcoholic who constantly beat him. According to Luckman, he was allegedly abused for 5 days by 2 men at his mother's house, and he enjoyed it. At 16, he dropped out of school and lived off unemployment benefits, occasionally earning money through unconventional relationships with people of the same sex. He also enjoyed cross-dressing in an attempt to change his life. Paul Luckman enlisted in the army at 17. Upon arrival at the unit, he was assigned to Robin Reed, who immediately charmed him. The young Luckman moved in with him. The combination of Reed's passion for weapons, violence, sadistic fantasies, and Satanism, and Luckman's willingness to follow him into this dark world, brought the two together instantly. They had been inseparable ever since. In hindsight, investigators realized it was only a matter of time before the pair attempted to act out their twisted fantasies. On August 4, 1982, the trial of Reed and Luckman began. From the start, media outlets from across Australia and an angry crowd clashed to catch a glimpse of the alleged monster duo who indulged in Satanism, torture, and bizarre rituals, and had murdered a boy. When Peter Aston's older brother, Michael, disappeared from his home in Melbourne after threatening to kill Reed and Luckman, a tactical response team was deployed to monitor everyone entering the courthouse. Rumors also swirled that the murdered boy's mother entered the courthouse armed with a knife. Though she sat just an arm's length from Reed during the trial, she refrained from using it. Given the severity of the charges, the case was referred to the Supreme Court of Sydney. The trial began on November 8, 1982. Paul Luckman pleaded not guilty. Robin Reed also pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Peter Aston's injuries were so horrific that the prosecution decided not to show the jury photos of the deceased. Since there was no doubt Reed and Luckman had killed Peter Aston, the court focused on determining which defendant had played the leading role in the atrocity. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Luckman was trying to shift blame onto Reed. Among numerous accusations, Luckman claimed he had been forced to participate in all the horrors under threat of death by Reed. Reed, meanwhile, began his defense by stating that his abnormal orientation had caused him great stress, because if his superiors had found out, he would have been discharged from the army. He also claimed that work pressures and his obsession with the occult led him to hear voices, which in turn drove him to murder. Despite the pair's claims, Terry Ryan's testimony corroborated all key points of the case. On November 26, 1982, the jury delivered its verdict. Both defendants, Reed and Luckman, were sentenced to life in prison. The presiding judge later stated that their crime was one of the most brutal and heartless ever tried in this state. In prison, Robin Reed was placed in protective custody for his own safety. On November 26, 1998, Reed applied for a sentence review and was again sentenced to life with a non-parole period of 24 years, meaning he wouldn't be eligible for release until 2006. As of June 2014, he had been denied parole 6 times. Though considered the more brutal killer, Luckman was treated with more respect behind bars than Reed. He survived prison by offering his services to fellow inmates in exchange for money and other prison currency. With each passing year, he grew more feminine. In 1989, he began hormone therapy after a psychiatrist determined he resembled a woman more than a man in many ways. A year later, He underwent full gender reassignment surgery in prison and changed his name to Nicole Louise Pierce. On October 26, 1999, she was released from the high-security male facility in inland New South Wales. The years had not been kind to Terry Ryan, the innocent boy Reed and Luckman had dragged into such a nightmare. He became an outcast, mocked and scorned by classmates and society. His life spiraled downward. He served time for assault and car theft. During his sentencing hearing, the court documented that Terry Ryan exhibited anti-authoritarian behavior, struggled with anger, and suffered from substance abuse. Thanks for watching and take care of yourselves. Every house harbors the memories, hopes, and dreams of all who have lived in it and will live in it. Yet such a house in the small town of Jericho in the state of New York on the coast of Long Island B, in its basement concealed a dark secret of its owner that had gone unrevealed for 30 years. On September 2, 1999, the Long Island police received a call from an excited man who reported that he had found an old tank with remains in the basement of his house. When the officers arrived at the address, they approached the spacious house and were met by the shocked homeowner named Ronald K., who told them that he had gone to the basement to remove his personal belongings from the house that had been sold the day before and discovered that not all of the trash had been removed. In the corner stood, among other things, a large, dirty barrel. It was rusty and old, had a capacity of 55 gallons, and was covered with faded labels. A note attached to the barrel stated that the barrel was too heavy to transport and that because of its weight and the chemical markings special equipment was required. Nevertheless, the movers carried the tank outside. The man decided to open the tank and inspect its contents. As soon as he opened the lid, a nauseating odor hit his nose, but that was not all. On the surface, he saw a dried leather hand and a woman's high-heeled shoes. The whole was covered in a heap of granular material and coated with a viscous, greenish chemical liquid. Cohen said he had lived in the house for 9 years and had never seen this tank before. It was obvious that what he saw made him uneasy, for he had lived in the house for more than years, and during all that time this tank had sat in the basement. The discovery did not arouse the police's suspicion. They searched the house and basement for clues to the incident, but by that time the tank had already been handled by many people and the police had no chance of finding the perpetrator's fingerprints. The only clue the investigators had was the tank itself and its contents. The tank was taken to a laboratory for analysis. It was immediately apparent that the tank was completely filled with small, pea-sized black and white plastic balls, which had to be scooped out of the barrel for several hours before the mummified remains could be fully excavated. Presumably, after the lid was closed, the oxygen was depleted, decomposition stopped, and a true mummy was formed. When the mummy was removed from the tank, it turned out to be a woman. She had dark hair below her shoulders, was of small stature, about 150 cm tall, and appeared to be between 25 and 35 years old. Strikingly, she had gold fillings in her 2 front teeth. Experts say such fillings were manufactured in Central America, so possibly the woman was Spanish. She was dressed in a leopard print faux fur coat and a floral patterned dress. On her feet, she wore woolen socks and shoes, the kind of clothing women wore in the 1960s and 1970s. But that was not all. The woman was 8 months pregnant. On the floor of the tank, the investigators found a viscous, green-tinted liquid, which later proved to be a mixture of bodily fluids and green paint. The police also found the woman's handbag, which contained her address book, a makeup kit, and a wallet with the business card of a long-retired doctor. Another strange find was a plastic stem with leaves, which also would play a role in the investigation. The handbag contained no identification but did contain a notebook. The book was badly damaged. Almost all entries had been erased or smeared, and it was decided to send it to specialists for restoration. In the meantime, the investigators checked all cases of missing Latina women from recent decades, but none matched the description of the discovered woman. It seemed that no one was even searching for the unfortunate woman. Normally, investigations in such a case begin by gathering information about the person, whom she was friends with, whom she associated with, and what she did. But in this case, the police had no information. The investigators decided to begin their inquiry with the house in which the tank was found. The house had been built in 1959. In the last 30 years, it had had 6 owners. It turned out that before the man who found the tank, 3 different families had lived there, successful families with children and no trouble with the law. The investigators were puzzled. It was unlikely that a homeowner would leave a tank with such contents in his basement even temporarily. While reviewing the case files, the investigator realized that everything he needed to solve the case was right before him, in the tank itself. His attention was first drawn to the markings on the tank, including the inscription RIM New Jersey. It turned out that RIM was a factory that manufactured tanks. The investigator went to the plant, where an employee explained that federal law requires all tanks produced there to be labeled, since many are used to store toxic substances and that the tanks can be traced by their numbers. Each number has a meaning. 55 stands for a 55-gallon tank, 3 indicates the steel wall's thickness. 363 means the tank was manufactured in March 60. The green sticker on the tank was the brand of a chemical company that had previously bought these tanks. The investigator learned that this chemical company was sold in the 1970s and that the green paint used on the tanks was discontinued then. The small balls found in the barrel were used for injection molding, melted and processed into toy soldiers, chairs, and plastic flowers. These connections gave the police important clues. It is suspected that the woman ended up in the tank sometime between 1960, the year the barrel was made, and 1970 when green paint production ceased. Most likely, the perpetrator either worked at the plastics factory that used green paint or had access to it. But one could spend a lot of time searching for a worker 30 years later and find no one. In the meantime, the notebook found in the tank was examined. Using modern infrared technology, experts were able to recover information from the erased pages, and almost vanished entries became visible again. The investigators had the clue to the woman's identity right in front of them. On the inside of the cover, they saw a number preceded by the letter A. It was assumed that the woman was Spanish and that this could be her registration number, since every immigrant to America is assigned a number. And it looked as though this number belonged to her. The investigator contacted the Immigration and Naturalization Service and requested the data for the person with that number. After verification, he received the name and a photo of the woman. That is how they learned her identity. Her name was Reina Angelica Mariquin, a 25-year-old woman who had arrived in America from El Salvador in August '66. The investigators did not know what dream Reina had been pursuing, but it was important to find out who had thwarted her plans. In the next few days, the investigator called every number in Reina's address book. After calling nearly everyone on the list, he dialed the last number, which belonged to a company in Manhattan's Garment District. A woman answered. The investigator explained his reason for calling, and she agreed to speak with him. Her name was Kathy Andrade. She had worked at that company since the early '60s and knew Reina well. When Kathy saw Reina's picture, she immediately began to cry and said, "Oh my God," and then she collapsed. The investigator nodded, and Kathy told him the story she had kept to herself for 30 years. New York City, 1967. Kathy and Reina met in a Catholic church in Manhattan. When Kathy heard Reina speak, she approached and asked, "Are you by any chance from El Salvador?" Reina replied, "Yes." Kathy said she was too. The women hit it off immediately and became friends. Reina told Kathy she was divorced and had come to New York the previous year to start a new life. She worked in a downtown factory and lived in a Catholic boarding house for young. Reina always smiled and was very curious. At church, she had a good reputation and all the parishioners loved her. Every day after work, Reina studied English. The friends saw each other almost every day and talked about everything that happened during the day. But Reina kept returning to her favorite topic, her boyfriend. She was in love, but she did not even tell her friend his name. The investigators learned from Kathy that he was married, since Reina only saw him on certain days. Kathy worried and said, "Be careful, you could get pregnant," to which Reina replied, "I am already pregnant, we will manage. My boyfriend said he will leave his wife and rent an apartment." Reina's mysterious boyfriend kept his promise. He rented an apartment and advised Reina to quit her job because he feared it could harm the baby. Kathy thought at the time that he simply did not want anyone to know about her situation, since he was married. After they moved in together, Kathy and Reina communicated every week, and if Reina did not call her, Kathy called Reina. Reina seemed very happy, for in every conversation Kathy learned that her boyfriend would soon leave his wife. The boyfriend took Reina to doctor's appointments every month, was kind to her, brought her food and everything else she needed. Kathy had the impression that things were going well for her friend. One evening, at the end of the workday at Kathy's company, the telephone rang. Kathy picked up and heard the voice of her friend Reina. She was excited and nervous. Through tears, Reina told Kathy, "I have seen his wife," and then began to repeat, "He threatened me, everything he said was a lie." Reina was 8 months pregnant. Tired of waiting for the man to repeat the same lies, she decided to tell them herself. After coming to her senses a little, Reina told Kathy she had called the boyfriend's wife and told her everything. In response, he called Reina and said he was very angry with her. Kathy dropped everything and hurried to her friend's apartment. When she arrived, she saw that the door was open. She entered and called out for Reina several times, but there was no answer. When she entered the room, Kathy saw a pair of shoes on the floor. In the kitchen, food was on the table and still warm. Kathy ran immediately to the police. They listened to her story but refused to file a report because several hours had passed. The police knew that married men often eloped with their pregnant lovers, and no one wanted to investigate Reina's disappearance. But Kathy knew her friend was in trouble. She returned to work and kept calling Reina's number, but no one answered. Kathy could find nowhere to go in her worry and thought about Reina every day. She did not know whom to turn to for help. She did not know Reina's family in El Salvador or where they lived. Since then, Kathy never heard from Reina again, but she always knew something had happened to her. After their conversation, Kathy gave the investigators the address of the Catholic boarding house where Reina had lived. The boarding house still had records showing Reina's residence. The investigators learned when she moved in and when she moved out. According to Kathy, Reina left the boarding house when she was 2 or 3 months pregnant, but was found when she was 8 months pregnant. Reina thus ended up in March or April '67 in the basement cell. The investigators then learned that Reina's boyfriend was married. These were also the 3 previous owners of the house where the tank was found. Land records showed that the wing of the house where the tank was stored was missing from the original plans. That extension had been built in the 1980s. Perhaps that is why the tank ended up in the basement. It remains to be determined who exactly built the addition. Thus, the investigators located the second owner of the house, Stan Miller. Miller said he had moved into the house in 1972 and then discovered that the addition was illegal. In 1980, he obtained a permit from the municipality and secured all necessary papers. Miller added that he knew about the tank, but thought it had been left over from the construction work and paid it no mind. He advised the investigators to speak with a man named Howard Elkins, who had lived in the house before him. After researching Elkins's background, the investigators learned that he was 40 years old at the time Reina was in the barrel. He was married, raised 3 children, and was a law-abiding citizen. But one thing was notable. Thanks to his father-in-law making him a partner in the plastics products firm, Elkins had a successful career. On the floor of the tank they had found a plastic film and green paint. The first owner of the house had operated a company that made such items, including flowers dyed with green paint. Elkins had worked in that plant for almost 20 years alongside his father-in-law and another partner named Melvin Ganton. After the company closed in the 70s, Elkins sold his house and moved with his family to Florida. The investigators traveled there to speak with Elkins, but first decided to verify their suspicion by locating his former partner Ganton, who also lived in Florida. The first thing Ganton was shown was the tank. He immediately said, "Yes, these are the kind of tanks you use to store green paint." He also identified the marbles found in the tank. When questioned about his former partner, Ganton explained that Howard was skilled with machinery and was a very strong and tough man. Ganton also stated that Elkins had a mistress, a young Hispanic woman with long black hair and gold teeth. The investigators realized Ganton was describing Raina. He did not know her name, but recalled she had worked at the plant for about a year. One day she simply did not show up for work and was never seen again. Ganton also remembered something else odd. An angry call from the landlord in New Jersey where Elkins had rented an apartment for Raina. The landlord said that if Howard did not pay the rent he would throw all her belongings onto the street. Ganton delivered the message to Elkins, who immediately got into his car and drove away. That evening he returned with a television and a suitcase. Although Ganton had not understood what was happening at the time, investigators 30 years later were certain that Elkins had removed all of Raina's belongings from her apartment, and that Raina herself was already in the tank in his basement. On September 9, 1999, 7 days after the mortal remains of 25-year-old Raina Angelica Marroquin were found in a tank under her house on Long Island, the investigators stood on the doorstep of Howard Elkins's house in Florida. When Elkins saw the police, he appeared shocked. For 33 minutes, Howard Elkins told them he had never seen that tank or its contents. The investigators asked, "Have you met the woman who worked at the plant?" Elkins answered, "Yes, I dated one, but that was a long time ago and the affair didn't last. When my father-in-law found out, he told me to end it immediately, and Elkins said he had done so. When asked the woman's name, he said he could not remember it. The investigators showed him pictures of Raina, but he said he had never met her. The officers then told him, "We are certain you are the one who disposed of the woman and placed her in the tank." Suddenly, the conversation was interrupted by a phone call from Elkins's wife. During the call, Elkins said nothing about the investigators' visit. After he hung up, he told the investigators they must leave. In Florida, they had no authority and no arrest warrant, but as they left, they warned him, "We're coming back soon with an arrest warrant for you." Before they even reached their cars, one investigator called his superior and requested a warrant for Howard Elkins. On September 10, the officers received a call from the Florida State Police informing them that Elkins's wife had filed a missing person report for her husband, who had left early that morning without taking his wallet. The Florida police began searching every possible location. 45 minutes later, he was found dead in his best friend's garage. His friend was on vacation. Elkins was sitting in the back seat of the owner's car. The investigators had no doubt. Howard Elkins knew it was time to answer for his deed. Instead, he chose to end his life and thus avoid a trial. The New York City labs compared Elkins's DNA with that of Raina Marroquin's baby, and it was a match. Raina's body had spent 30 years in the tank while Elkins lived a quiet life and raised 3 children. Kathy, Raina's friend, still blames herself and says, "For years I thought if I had come 5 or 10 minutes earlier, Raina would still be alive." The police located Raina's family. Her mother had no idea what had become of her daughter or where to look for her. Raina was returned to El Salvador and buried in the family grave. Raina's mother died shortly thereafter and was buried next to her daughter. Thank you for watching and take care.